New York City was ravaged by the crack epidemic of the 1980s and 90s, and during that time it saw an extraordinary rise in drug gangs and violence. One of the most violent criminal organizations of that era was the crew of mostly Dominican hustlers and enforcers who ran a crack ring in the South Bronx and would one day be dubbed by the media as the Wild Cowboys. Nelson Sepulveda was born in the Washington Heights neighborhood of New York City on January 30th, 1967. His younger brother Lenin was born less than 11 months after him in the same year on December 22nd, 1967. Lenin was named after the Russian leader Vladimir Lenin, but he would be known as Lenny from a young age. Their parents had immigrated from the city of Santiago in the Dominican Republic and settled on West 171st Street. Their father Roberto was the son of a blacksmith and worked as a TV and radio repairman, while their mother did factory work. Their parents struggled to acclimate to their new lives in New York City and were often at odds with each other, which was exacerbated by Roberto's heavy drinking. Lenny was a smart kid, but rowdy from a very early age. In elementary school, he was adept at drawing, but by his pre-adolescence, he often got in trouble for cutting school and for various other offenses. By the time Nelson was 13, he was writing graffiti on train cars and doing strong-arm and knife robberies on the subway. During the 1970s and 80s, Washington Heights was the most popular destination for Dominican immigrants. With this influx of Dominicans included many people who had worked in the drug trade back on the island. The Dominican Republic has long been a prime transportation hub for Colombian cartels who were trafficking cocaine. The city of San Francisco de Macorís in particular was an epicenter for drug activity in the Caribbean, and many of the immigrants who arrived in Washington Heights came from there as well as other drug hotbeds in DR, causing the narcotics activity in the neighborhood to soar. By their early teens, Lenny and Nelson were hanging closely with other kids from West 171st Street, such as Danny Rincon, their hefty neighbor who was known as Fat Danny. Fat Danny's half-brother, Victor Mercedes, Jose Llaca, known as Pasqualito or Pac for short, and David Polanco, who was called Dominican David. These kids from 171st became tight with each other, palled around, played sports, and took part in criminal activities together. By the early 80s, Dominican drug dealers were a dime a dozen in the Sepulveda's neighborhood, but one which stood out above the rest was a savvy young hustler from West 174th Street named Santiago Luis Polanco-Rodriguez, but was better known by his street name Yayo. Yayo was running a cocaine gang along Audubon Avenue, which sold a brand named Coke is It, a name taken from the marketing slogan used by Coca-Cola. His partner was a 21-year-old professional boxer named Roberto Mejia, who was known as Capo, and they catered to people going to and from New Jersey via the nearby George Washington Bridge. Nelson first attended Martin Luther King High School in the Upper West Side of Manhattan, but was a menace in school. After he threw a garbage can at a teacher, then punched the dean in his face, he was kicked out and transferred to George Washington High School in Washington Heights. Lenny also attended GW, and both he and Nelson were members of the high school football team. Nelson played the tackle position, and in 1984, when he was a junior, his name was mentioned several times in the newspaper. Lenny, Nelson, and several of their buddies became part of a youth gang named the Royal Playboys, which took part in crimes ranging from car theft to muggings. The brothers were known to be good with their fists and were often involved in fights with other local youth gangs such as the Ball Busters. None of the kids graduated from GW, and soon all of them were running the streets together full-time. The kids got involved with the area's most popular illegal street trade, which was cocaine dealing. They first began getting ounces of cocaine on consignment and broke it down into smaller quantities to sell on the streets. Then soon they escalated to larger purchases and were reselling ounces at inflated prices to commuters from New Jersey.
Then, in early 1985, that young hustler, Yayo, would change the entire drug landscape in New York City and far beyond. After he was introduced to the smokable derivative of cocaine known as crack, he was the first to jump on the train to sell it, and along with his second-in-command, Capo, they quickly built the foremost crack-dealing organization in New York. They dealt crack rocks in red-top vials under the brand name Baseballs, which quickly became a sought-after product for drug users. They sold vials that went for $5 or $10 a piece, and also sold larger vials called jumbos for $20. By the end of 1985, Baseballs was mass-producing, and it was the first known ring in New York to move the product in large quantities.
By the spring of 1986, the Baseballs operation was immense and was pulling in as much as $100,000 in a single day, and Yayo was now the drug chieftain of Washington Heights. He hired local teens to work for him, and the dealers who sold Baseballs vials were called pitchers. He and Capo set up more locations on Audubon Avenue, St. Nicholas Avenue, and at several areas nearby in the Bronx, including right here on Beech Terrace in the rough Mott Haven section of the South Bronx. They set up at 603-605 Beech Terrace, a building which once stood to my right. Capo was hands-on at Beech Terrace, as well as at a Baseballs location set up in Yonkers, New York. Yayo's organization followed the hierarchy of Colombian cartels, with the brand owner sitting at the top, and different levels of managers looking after each department below them.
Another kid from West 171st Street, known as Mike the Dome, was managing Baseballs locations for Yayo in Harlem. Mike knew Lenny and Nelson from the neighborhood and hired them to work for him. The brothers first began running various errands and doing dirty work, on one occasion burning down a rival's apartment in the Bronx at Yayo's behest. Lenny was taught how to set up and secure production apartments, but his smarts and knack for the trade would lead him to bigger things. When Mike opened up other Baseballs retail spots, he brought Lenny, Nelson, and other kids along with him, and soon Lenny was pitching for him at West 166th Street near Edgecombe Avenue. In January of 1986, Mike was arrested for outstanding warrants, and he would spend the next 2 years in prison.
Soon Capo brought Lenny and Nelson on board to manage the Baseballs chain at Beech Terrace and worked out a profit-sharing system with them, giving them a percentage of sales rather than a set salary. They set up in apartment 1H on the first floor and accordingly named the operation 1H. But soon after they came to Beech Terrace, in December of 1986, the Baseballs operation took a major blow when Capo and his wife were arrested at their drug spot in Yonkers. There, authorities found a bevy of incriminating evidence, including 40 pounds of cocaine, 5 pounds of crack rocks, and over $700,000 in cash. With Capo now sidelined, Lenny and Nelson became the leaders of the Baseballs chain at Beech Terrace.
At 6 feet tall and powerfully built, with a dark, menacing stare accented by thick connecting eyebrows, Lenny had a commanding presence to him and was a man of few words. He came across intimidating to anyone who didn't know him, but was well liked by his associates and underlings, while being feared by his rivals, the optimal package of traits to be a successful gang leader. Nelson, who was smaller and more athletically built, had an air of treachery to him, and wasn't as well liked as Lenny, with some describing him as being a shyster.
One thing that the brothers had in common was that they were both ready to use violence to maintain their business and were always armed. In February of 1987, a drug customer who had the unwise effrontery to wave a machete at Lenny received a gunshot to his stomach for his insolence. One time, a woman was yelling at Nelson from her window about his street activities, and Nelson responded by firing several gunshots in her direction. Soon after the brothers took over Beech Terrace, their brazen ways were apparent, and the other drug crews in the building were scared off.
Around this time, a young Puerto Rican hustler named Jose Reyes, known on the streets as El Feo, meaning the ugly one in Spanish, was rising on the streets of Washington Heights. Said to be highly intelligent and wise beyond his years, some also called Reyes Monchichi because of his resemblance to the toy doll. He worked for a major heroin dealer named Rogelio Perez, better known as Chocolate, and after Chocolate was sentenced to a prison term in 1987, at only 17 years old, El Feo stepped in to run his spot on 167th in Amsterdam. Feo also became a close drug partner to Lenny and Nelson. In May of 1987, the walls came crashing down on Yayo and the Baseballs organization. After several informants began cooperating with police, Yayo's manufacturing apartments in the Kingsbridge section of the Bronx were raided by authorities and numerous people were arrested.
There they found 50 pounds of pure cocaine, an arsenal of automatic weapons, drug paraphernalia, and hundreds of thousands of Baseballs vials. Yayo and his family barely escaped arrest, then headed to the airport and fled back to DR with fake passports. There they would spend their remaining days as absconders from American justice, and Yayo went on to become a successful businessman and community benefactor in Santiago. With Yayo and Capo out of the picture, it was Lenny and Nelson's time to shine, and they were now the owners of the Baseballs chain at 603-605 Beech Terrace. Learning from the mistakes of their predecessor, they did away with brand names, as that helped police connect dealers to their product, and now Baseballs was simply known as Red Top Crack. Soon, Lenny began getting supplied with packages of vials known as bundles by two brothers from Sedgwick Avenue. While Lenny was disciplined and structured, Nelson had a lackadaisical approach and was often smoking weed and not keeping an eye on his workers, and the business struggled. When Nelson began adding rocks to his blunts for an added high, his control over the business further diminished. Sales dropped and workers began stealing from him. Then, when Nelson got sick with pneumonia, Lenny stepped in to lead the way, and order was immediately instilled. The business quickly began to see a positive turnaround, and from there on out, it was clear who needed to be in charge of Red Top. The brothers brought in their old pals from Washington Heights, including Victor, Pasqualito, and Fat Danny, as well as other kids that they knew from their old hangout on West 174th and Audubon. Lenny named the managers, delegated the shifts, and set their salaries. Several residents in Beech Terrace lent out their apartments as stash houses for drugs and weapons in return for payment.
Within a short time, the 1H operations revenue increased exponentially, and soon it was bringing in as much as $30,000 a week, with Lenny taking home around $5,000 in profit and Nelson $3,000. With the rise in earnings came a rise in violence, and the brothers and their squad quickly developed a fearsome reputation. Victor and Pasqualito were a ferocious pair who kept things in line for the gang. Vic was a quick-tempered, loose cannon who was always looking for a reason to commit violence and had been in and out of correctional facilities since he was 13. Pac was also a rugged thug, but more pragmatic than Vic, and became a favorite of Lenny's to carry out hits. Then there was Ulises Mena, aka Dominican Chino, who grew up just around the corner from Lenny and Nelson on Fort Washington Avenue and worked as an enforcer for the gang. When local Bronx kids caught wind of the money train at Beech Terrace, several of them sought employment with the Wild Cowboys, including Ed Sanchez, aka Ed O.D., and Linwood Coolwater Collins.
Although the gang is now universally known as the Wild Cowboys, they were first known in the streets as Lenny's Boys, then later the Red Top Crew. Then, when this mostly Dominican crew of hustlers and enforcers gained notoriety in a Puerto Rican neighborhood, Some refer to them as the Dominican Red Top Crew, even though they employed numerous blacks and Puerto Ricans.
In January of 1988, there was a major fire at the Beech Terrace building. The fire began in apartment 1E right next door to the 1H operation and destroyed much of the building and displaced numerous families. Afterwards, the Red Top operation became scattered across nearby buildings, corners, and apartments while they sought new arrangements.
Several crack addicts were pitching for the gang in order to feed their habits, including an NYPD officer named Marilyn Perez, as well as her sister. Lenny was well informed on the legal system, and so he hired juveniles to work for him, as the youth offender laws helped to shield them from various procedures, thus insulating him from his workers. Some of these kids included 17-year-old Angel Tito Cruz and his younger brothers, 15-year-old Michael Cruz and 11-year-old Joey Morales. Lenny paid them to run various errands, including bringing the stashes from Beech Terrace to the store spots. The gang also had attorneys on retainer to handle legal matters as needed, some of which came from the Bronx law firm Goldstein, Weinstein, and Fuld, whose attorneys represented many Latino kingpins.
Lenny and his team of Wild Cowboys attended New York's hottest nightclubs together, including the Palladium, the Limelight, and Latin Quarters, and would pay bouncers to let them slide in the back door with their guns. One evening, while they were in attendance at a Manhattan hotspot named Club 1018, they had an altercation with another crew, which resulted in a shootout between them.
On July 20th, 1988, a New York State corrections officer named Guy Gaines had gotten into an argument with the Red Top manager while purchasing bundles of vials. When Pac overheard the commotion, he retrieved his gun so he could handle the situation. Pac tracked Gaines to Cypress Avenue and then gunned him down, then shot and wounded a nearby crack addict who simply had the misfortune of being a witness to the killing. The following month, the addict testified to a grand jury, and in August of 1988, Pasqualito was arrested, but he was later acquitted at trial after claiming to have bribed some witnesses with drugs.
As 1988 came to a close, urban neighborhoods around the country were experiencing a full-blown epidemic as the result of crack. Violence, crime, and murders had skyrocketed all over New York City, and Washington Heights and the South Bronx had degraded into tumultuous war zones. At this time, the 40th precinct of Mott Haven had also first become aware that a group of Dominicans in the area were selling Red Top vials. A detective from the 40th precinct named Mark Tebbins would become a lead investigator of the Wild Cowboys. Standing 6'5", Tebbins, who was half Puerto Rican and raised in the Bronx, was a former Golden Gloves boxer and D1 football player at Northeastern University. He would investigate many of the gang's crimes and be a thorn in their side for years to come. However, Tebbins was a dirty cop. He would later be accused of corruption and using illegal tactics during the course of building a case against the Wild Cowboys and other gangs, in addition to taking payoffs from various criminals.
As 1989 came around, the crew continued to expand, and they recruited more friends from their neighborhood in Washington Heights, including Fernando Freddy Sendra and Daniel Gonzalez, who was known as Shorty.
By now, the Cowboys had bullied their way into another building just steps away and moved their operation from Beech Terrace to 348 Beekman Avenue. The structure had a convenient layout. Customers could enter down a small flight of steps, then through a narrow passageway and into a courtyard which had room for dozens of people to gather at once, completely out of street view. The managers would oversee the business from the platform one level up. This location became known as The Hole and instantly took off, soon bringing in over $10,000 a day in sales.
Steerers would direct traffic, and lookouts would patrol the roof of the building with walkie-talkies and keep an eye out for the Bronx TNT, the Tactical Narcotics Team. As soon as law enforcement vehicles even came close to the building, lookouts would alert the managers, who would then pull the pitchers from outside and hide them in the stash apartments. Several building residents rented out their apartments as stash houses to the gang, including Iris Cruz and Elizabeth Morales, who were the mothers to Red Top workers Tito, Michael, and Joey. Additionally, the gang had a police officer from the 40th precinct named Victor Nazar on the payroll, who would transport drugs for them, alert them to any investigations, and feed them inside information.
Dominican former All-Star Major League Baseball player Manny Ramirez came to Washington Heights from DR in his early teens and became a star baseball player at George Washington High School. When Manny wasn't practicing, he hung out in the neighborhood where he met and became friends with Lenny and Nelson. Like many less privileged kids from the Heights, the teenage Ramirez thought that the drug trade could solve his financial problems, and so he rode his bicycle from 170th and Audubon a few miles to Beekman Avenue on several occasions to ask Lenny for work. To help him out, Lenny would give him some cash, but declined his request to work for him, telling him to instead focus on his baseball career, as his talent was well known.
By 1989, El Feo had risen to prominence and sold several heroin brands, such as Eyewitness News, Red Alert, and High Blue, and he also had cocaine and crack plugs. He now had several spots, including right here at West 167th Street and Amsterdam Avenue in Washington Heights, as well as 2 spots in the Bronx, 1770 Andrews Avenue, and out of the Moriscos del Caribe restaurant.
One of El Feo's workers was Miguel Castillo, known as Miguelito, who was a former star baseball player at GW High School and also grew up on West 171st Street in the Heights. Miguel originally worked for Lenny but left to try out for the Los Angeles Dodgers, and after failing to make the team, he returned to find out that his role had been replaced by someone else. So Miguelito reached out to El Feo, who set him up at a heroin spot on Marcy Place in the Bronx, in which Lenny and Victor were also involved.
El Feo supplied Miguelito with work, and he in turn supplied 2 dealers at Marcy Place, 20-year-old Orlando Tito Berrios and 18-year-old Luis Chico Rivera. Tito and Chico then resold the heroin they bought from Miguelito to another dealer named Edwin Ortiz, who worked at a spot on East 141st and St. Anne's Avenue. But by May of 1989, Edwin had discovered who Tito and Chico were getting their work from and tried to bypass them by reaching out directly to Miguelito. Miguelito was receptive to Edwin's business, but word got back to Tito and Chico about Miguelito entertaining the idea of overstepping them. Tito and Chico also happened to be $5,000 in debt to Miguelito, so they decided to make a move. On May 31st, 1989, Miguelito left Marcy Place with Tito and Chico, allegedly so they could get the money that they owed him. Later that evening, the bullet-riddled dead body of 22-year-old Miguelito Castillo was discovered at a country club in Eastchester, New York. Tito and Chico were now relieved of their debt and the possibility of Miguelito overstepping their business, but they had failed to account for the crew of extremely dangerous street hoods who were behind him. El Feo was distraught over Miguelito's death, as were numerous others, because he was loved by many. Since Miguelito was last seen leaving Marcy Place with Tito and Chico, suspicions pointed solely in their direction, and Lenny and El Feo weren't about to let his death go by unavenged.
Lenny brought over another hoodlum from Washington Heights named Wilfredo de Los Angeles, who was known since a young age as Platano, the Spanish word for plantain, a food which is a staple of Dominican life and culture. Platano worked as a mechanic in the neighborhood, where Lenny allegedly met him at a shop where he used to take his car.
After Lenny's main cocaine supplier was arrested, he began getting supply, known in the streets as work, from different connects. Lenny and Nelson set up a kitchen in an apartment on Aqueduct Avenue where they would have workers cook up product. The brothers initially brought the rocks from Aqueduct Avenue to Beech Terrace themselves, but then put Platano in charge of transportation.
Platano also happened to be a very skilled driver who knew how to maneuver New York streets by using sidewalks and weaving in and out of small spaces to make a clean getaway. He was fastidious in the care of his vehicles, often having them detailed at car shops. But moreover, Platano had a ruthless demeanor, as well as an expertise in using various different weapons. He kept guns in secret compartments in his vehicles called clavos in Spanish, and along with his driving skills, he became an invaluable asset as a hitman for the Wild Cowboys. His impetuous propensity for violence could be exemplified with the story of how he allegedly once shot and killed a gypsy cab driver after a dispute over the fare. The burly Pasqualito was quick with the trigger and wouldn't hesitate to shoot anyone who got out of line. This inclination towards brutality also led him to become a chief enforcer, and along with Platano, the two became go-to hitmen for the crew.
The crew's social club was in an apartment in the building right behind me, 354 Cypress Avenue. There, they would discuss business matters, eat, play video games, and hang out with local girls. The leaseholder was a woman named Mireya Betancourt, who cooked food for the gang and had her rent paid in return for lending out her apartment to them. From there, Lenny would give orders to Nelson, who was running the kitchen at the Aqueduct Avenue apartment.
Throughout the summer of 1989, business was booming at the Hole, with long lines forming to make purchases of red top vials, leading to big-time profits for the organization. Although Lenny was making a lot of money at only 21 years old, he wasn't the materialistic type. He had his share of expensive things, such as a white W126 Mercedes-Benz S-Class convertible, but he wasn't flamboyant and hated attention. He didn't splurge on splashy items like expensive jewelry. Instead, he liked motorcycles, clubbing, and would take trips to Miami and DR, where he would meet up with numerous different women. Lenny was also a huge sports buff and particularly enjoyed NFL football and was a big fan of the Dallas Cowboys.
In the late evening on September 3rd, 1989, Miguelito's killers, Tito and Chico, along with two of their friends, headed to visit Tito's girlfriend in a drug delivery cab. They made a stop at the bodega right behind me at East 141st Street and Beekman Avenue to purchase some beer. And here they saw an old friend named El, and they stopped to chat with him. But Tito and Chico were now in enemy territory. Just across the street from this powwow were a group of men which included Lenny, Victor, and Pasqualito, who were eyeing them closely. Soon the men surrounded Tito, Chico, and their friends, and Victor shot Tito in the stomach. Badly wounded, Tito took off running down East 141st, being pursued by Pasqualito and others, while Chico and his friends began running down Beekman Avenue, being pursued by Victor. Chico jumped into his cab but was shot 5 times by Victor, while the driver was also struck in the leg as he sped away towards Lincoln Hospital.
Tito sprinted down East 141st Street as several men chased him. Then when he got to Cypress Avenue, he turned left and continued towards St. Mary's Park. As he was running, he came upon a green sedan driving by and dove through the passenger window and grabbed the wheel. When the car owner saw armed men approaching, he jumped out of the vehicle.
Tito tried to drive the car from the passenger seat, but crashed into a van right here at 353 Cypress Avenue. Then Pac advanced on him and shot him 10 times, even shooting the thumb off of his left hand. As Tito laid there dead, his beeper went off, and Pac said, "This is for Miguelito," then threw a quarter on his lap and said, "Now go make your call." Luis Chico Rivera later passed away at the hospital, and this double murder came to be known by police in the 40th Precinct as the Double. In the weeks after the double, Tebbins and other detectives located some witnesses to the shootings who picked Victor and Pasqualito out of a photo lineup, and they were both arrested and charged with the killings. They waited for their leaders, Lenny and Nelson, to bail them out, but that never happened, and they were quite displeased about that.
In November of 1989, 27-year-old Frankie Cuevas had returned from an 8-year prison stint for burglarizing the home of an 81-year-old woman who he also brutally assaulted. Called Gus by his friends, but known as Fat Frankie to others, even though he was built like a bull at 6 feet tall and 230 pounds, he was an old associate of Yayo's who went back with him to the 1970s in Washington Heights when they were both part of the same youth gang and also began selling drugs around the same time.
Knowing that Frankie Cuevas had come up with his mentor, Lenny was going to help him get back on his feet. When Frankie was in prison, he had learned about a profitable location right here at the intersection of Manor and Watson in the Soundview neighborhood, a few miles away from Beekman Avenue. So Lenny and Frankie sent their hitman to this intersection to kill the people who were set up on this block, and afterwards Frankie took over. Lenny fronted bricks of cocaine to Frankie under the agreement that he would pay him $2,000 on every kilo sold and would only purchase work from him, which unbeknownst to Frankie, Lenny was getting directly from El Feo. Lenny also introduced him to an associate named Raymond Crazy Ray Polanco, who ran his own crack spots at the Gowanus houses in Brooklyn, carried out hits, and also trafficked guns to various different gangs. Polanco sold Frankie tens of thousands of dollars worth of artillery so he could protect his operation. Cuevas' spot quickly took off, and he brought in his own crew, which included men named Manny Garcia, Gilbert Camposano, Andres Carrella, aka Smiley, Danny Montilla, who was known as Madonna, and Jose Vizcaino, better known as Cuba or Cubitas. Madonna was previously with the Cowboys but had left to join Frankie, and Cuba and Smiley would become Frankie's top triggermen and carry out many hits on his behalf.
From the time that Frankie and Lenny connected, the two became tight and were hanging out together and attending different venues around the city. Frankie often frequented a restaurant at 173rd and St. Nick in Washington Heights named 20 de Mayo, which was like his office where he carried out business matters. By the end of 1989, Beekman Avenue was controlled by a squad of ruthless killers. The hole was running 24 hours a day, with crowds of people lining up to make purchases, including middle and upper class customers coming from the suburbs, and was pulling in over $100,000 in revenue per week. Frankie Cuevas' spot at Manor and Watson was also getting bigger by the day. But unbeknownst to his new generation of associates, he was an extremely nefarious character, and his return from prison marked the start of troubles to come for the Wild Cowboys and many others.